Welcome to the Natural Podcast of Selborne, hosted by Gilbert White's House and Gardens. I am Kimberly James, the collections manager here at Gilbert White's house. I love Gilbert White, but wish I knew a little bit more about the natural world he describes. So, every fortnight we will take a deep dive into Gilbert White's pioneering 1789 book, The Natural History of Selborne, to learn more about the natural world both in the 18th century and today. We will talk to some amazing experts and all become a little more Gilbert.
The most unusual birds I ever observed in these parts were a pair of hoopoes, Hoopoe, which came several years ago in the summer and frequented an ornamented piece of ground which joins to my garden for some weeks. They used to march about in a stately manner, feeding in the walks many times in the day, and seemed disposed to breed in my outlet, but were frightened and persecuted by idle boys who would never let them be at rest.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today we are diving into the world of art. One of the great things about the Natural History of Selborne is that most editions have the most beautiful illustrations. So many artists have lent their pencil, brush, pen, or chisel to create the world of Gilbert White into the illustrations you see on the page, and that is what we're going to discuss today. So I suppose the question is, why this letter? Why did I decide to talk about art for this letter? Now, whenever I read letter 11, which is the letter that we're talking about today, I can't help but think about art. I mean, on the whole, it's a fairly typical Gilbert White letter. He flits from observation to observation. He talks about birds, fish, bats. However, for me, this letter conjures up a particular memory. So back in 2020, Gilbert had his 300th birthday anniversary. Not a great year for a celebration, but one of the things that did happen was I was lucky enough to visit, in between the lockdowns, Pallant House Gallery's excellent exhibition, Drawn to Nature, which celebrated Gilbert White's legacy within the world of art. A few years later, we had a smaller version of that same exhibition here, and one of the things that struck me, both in the Pallant House and the Gilbert White's house version of the exhibition, was just how many artists had used this letter when creating their works of art. And the thing that popped out and the motif that I kept seeing was hoopoes. I've never seen so many hoopoes in one room. Hoopoes, for those like me who have never seen one in the flesh, are, as Gilbert says, the most unusual birds. They are pinky orange, black stripy markings, and some fabulous plumage on their heads. Typically, they live a little bit further south than the UK. I know people that say that they see them when they're on holiday in places like France, Italy, places like that. But every now and again, they do make it up into Hampshire and tend to cause quite the commotion. There were a pair spotted in Alton, our nearest town, maybe last summer, and yes, it was in the local news. It's such a rare occurrence. The other reason I really want to talk about art today is not just because of the hoopoes in this letter. It's because we are currently celebrating an anniversary. It is 250 years, no, not of American independence, although it is, but it is also 250 years since Samuel Hieronymus Grimm visited Selborne and visited Gilbert White. The reason that Grimm was in Selborne for the summer of 1776 was because he had been commissioned to come to Selborne to create the drawings that would make up the illustrations of the Natural History of Selborne. Grimm was with Gilbert for a month, and in that time created 12 iconic images, some of which would become part of the first edition of the Natural History of Selborne, published in 1789. The exhibition we currently have on, which has just started, is all about this time. So, how Grimm and White got together and what Gilbert was like as a patron, what Grimm was like as an artist, and the results of that project. It's called A Summer with Grimm and it's on until the end of September. So please do come and have a look. Our guest today is Simon Martin. Simon is the director of Pallant House Gallery in Chichester, which has one of the best public collections of British modern art. He is an art historian who created the exhibition that I mentioned earlier, Drawn to Nature, Gilbert White and the Artists, and wrote the most wonderful book by the same name. He is the perfect person to talk about this merging of the world of art and the world of illustration with the world of Gilbert White and natural history. So let's cut to the interview.
We are 20 miles from the sea, and almost as many from a great river, and therefore see but little of seabirds. As to wild fowls, we have a few teams of ducks bred in the moors where the snipes breed, and multitudes of widgeons and teals in hard weather frequent our lakes in the forest.
Hi, Simon. How are you?
I'm great, thank you, Kimberly. Great to be with you today to talk about Gilbert White.
Oh, thank you for coming. So, what brought you to Gilbert White? How did you, an art historian, come to discover a natural historian like from the 18th century?
Well, I think for me, as the you know director of a museum of modern British art, it was really through, as you suggest, it was really through the work of the modern British artists. I knew a little bit about Gilbert White in relation to nature, but it was actually his the illustrations of an edition from 1938 by Eric Revilius, which I'd seen in books and I'd seen, I think, a few in exhibitions in the past. And so I knew those, and I had a copy of the edition that was illustrated by John Piper. And I think I'd had that for, 15, 20 years. And it's one of those things which kind of sat on the bookshelf and occasionally I would look at it. And then in 2019, I was interviewing for an assistant job at the gallery. And one of the things I always do when I do interviews is I ask the candidates to do a presentation on their favorite artwork. And I think it's such an interesting question because, of course, you learn about people's enthusiasms, you learn about can they analyze an image? Are they visually literate? Can they do presentations? Are they able to really kind of engage the people around them? And actually, the person I appointed, my assistant Becky, did a presentation about one of the Eric Revilius wood engravings, which was the Hoopoes in the garden. And it was such an engaging and interesting snapshot of this particular work, and it really kind of made me think about both Revilius and Ethelbert White, and what was the story here. And a couple of weeks later, I decided to go to Selborne, and I went to visit Gilbert White's house for the first time. And I think probably like many people who go to Gilbert White's house and museum, I was sort of completely enamored by the location, being able to see the hanger of woods behind, seeing the garden, seeing the various exhibits in the house. And whilst I was going around the house, I noticed the birth date of Gilbert White was on one of the wall texts, and this was in spring 2019. And I noticed that the birth date was 1720, and I was thinking, next year is the tercentenary. And so I went home and I took the John Piper edition off my shelf and I had a look at that. And I started to make lists of the editions I could find that were illustrated by artists, because I knew that other artists had done it, but I wasn't quite sure. And of course, actually, it became this sort of minor obsession for a while, trying to find all of the different illustrators. And of course, there are many, many books on Gilbert White, but actually, there was nothing on Gilbert White and all of the artists who had illustrated his Natural History of Selborne at that point in time. And I thought, here is a real opportunity. And I managed to find a pamphlet, I think from Manchester Polytechnic Library, I think from 1989. There was this kind of little pamphlet that listed a few of these things with no illustrations, I don't think. But it gave me the idea of doing an exhibition in the print room at Pallant House Gallery. And this is a room where we have cases for the displays of drawings and works on paper. And so the following year, in March 2020, we opened an exhibition, and it basically brought together. It wasn't just an exhibition of lots of books open. It was actually we managed to trace original drawings, some of the wood engravings, some of the actual watercolors and drawings which had been reproduced. We had a copy of the first edition with this extraordinary opening image by Samuel Euronymous Grimm with this kind of vista across Selborne, but then also some of the electrotype blocks that had been made from Revilius's wood engravings. We had some of the blocks for later editions, and then also I commissioned 11 contemporary artists to make new illustrations for it. And so it felt like it was not just looking to the past, but also to the present. Now, what happened, of course, is the exhibition opened on the 12th of March 2020. And of course, we closed 3 days later because of the COVID pandemic. But what was so it was then closed for several months, and then it reopened in August 2020. And in those intervening months, of course, everyone had started to go out into nature. They'd looked out of their windows at birds. They'd had a moment to really pause and think, and everyone was going for walks in the countryside and suddenly becoming aware of the world around them. And so when the exhibition actually, properly opened to the public, it suddenly took on much more resonance, I think, than perhaps it had in March 2020. And so it became, I think, a very, very special project, particularly for me during the pandemic, because actually in those intervening months, although the exhibition had opened, I continued thinking about Gilbert White. And I think probably every few days I kept buying books on the internet and tracking down these first editions, and actually I continued to find things that we hadn't actually had in the print room show during that time, I think because it became such an interest for me. So it was a a really wonderful and very special project.
It was wonderful. And I think what you say about how the lockdown changed its significance is absolutely correct. And it's such a shame that Gilbert White's birthday was the year that COVID struck. But in some ways, it's quite fitting that the way that everybody celebrated his anniversary was also sort of become a little bit more like him.
Yes, absolutely. And I think also the thing that happened during COVID was, I think we all had more time both to stop and observe, but also to think and to read. And I know personally, it would have been very difficult for me to go on to then write the book that I wrote if COVID hadn't happened. And actually, I think it was during the second lockdown, which was in November 2020, I had, I think it was about a month or 6 weeks, followed then, of course, by the one which was 5 months. And so during that time, I then, I had a lot of things. I mean, I don't think I've ever been busier in a way in terms of all of the work we were having to do with the gallery to keep things going. But actually, it gave me the time, because I wasn't doing other things. I spent a lot of time working on the book. And actually, I think one of my most special memories from that time was, of course, trying to get all of the images for the book. The book ended up coming out, I think, in the autumn of 2021. And but there were images I just could not find anywhere. One of them, for example, was the wonderful stained glass window in Selborne Church, and I could not find a reproducible photograph of it. And actually, the verger of Selborne Church, I think this was in April 2020, he very kindly opened up the church, especially for me to go in, and I stood on a ladder and photographed that window. And for anyone who's not seen it, it shows St. Francis of Assisi giving his sermon to the birds. And I think there's over 100 different birds
Mm.
reproduced in this window. And the window was actually made for the bicentenary of Gilbert White's birth in 1920.
Mm.
And in the background of this extraordinary stained glass window, you can see the church, and there is this vista of Selborne, and it was a very, very special memory, I think. And I think those I think this is the thing about how Selborne has such a particular sense of place, and we know it from the descriptions in the letters, and how he is so particular about what, the bird life, the animal life, the insect life that he's seen. But actually, we get such a great a wider sense of how everything connects, and actually to then go there and see all of these things relatively unchanged, I think is very special.
Absolutely. So, why do you think the natural history of Selborne is so attractive to artists? I mean, there have been some quite big names that have attempted it. We've already spoken about Eric Revilius, but John Nash is the other one that always comes to mind. What is it about this book?
I think the thing about Gilbert White and the natural history of Selborne is the fact that he, in a way, gives artists the most perfect brief, because every single observation is both poetic and particular. It is so he is so richly descriptive, and I think for an artist you have such an extraordinary choice of subjects that you can, and you have these moments which are really quite literary. For example, when he writes about the Duke of Richmond's moose
Mm.
and going to Goodwood to see this moose, and then he turns up and it's already died. And when you look at different, I mean, Eric Revilius shows it in quite a celebrated image of, Revilius, of course, loved greenhouses, and so he does this greenhouse. Um, John Nash makes it completely comic, and actually this putrid sense smell is sort of, you can almost see it in the image, and so I think it's different artists bring different things. Sometimes they bring the humor, sometimes they bring the poetry. And I think one of the things also is that you have these kind of layers of artists referencing other layers. And one of the editions, which is not that well known because it was made during the Second World War, and it was one of the little Penguin books, and it was made on very cheap um, war issue paper, and it was Claire Leighton's edition of this, and she'd made a series of wood engravings for it. And actually, Claire Leighton was always drawn to subjects like rural labor, and so what she does is she depicts women working in the fields in Selborne. And I was really fascinated by this. And actually, I was wondering, is there a particular letter that White has talked about this? And I actually realized what it was in the background, in the distance of the Samuel Euronymous Grimm opening kind of vista across Selborne, there are several women working in the fields. And so you can see that actually that's the thing that she's been inspired by. Or in the new editions, Christopher Brown, who is a printmaker, he actually worked with Edward Borden early in his career, and printed with him. He was one of the 11 artists I asked to do new illustrations, and he did his own version of um, Timothy the tortoise walking in the garden, and it it shows a scene where White describes Timothy. He said it hobbles towards its benefactress, who was his cousin Rebecca Snook, at Ringmer in
Mm.
Sussex, and it was from her that he acquired Timothy and brought Timothy. I was going to say he, but I think they discovered that Timothy was actually female after Timothy's eventual demise.
Yes, yeah.
But and I think there's certain characters. There's a cast of characters in Gilbert White's letters. I think Timothy is perhaps one of the most memorable. I think because Timothy is clearly actually a rather irritable tortoise. Is not always the most happy of tortoises, and but actually there are some, of course, Revilius does a really wonderful wood engraving of Gilbert White standing bewigged in the garden alongside
Mm.
observing Timothy. But actually, one of the other artists that we commissioned for the new series was Emily Sutton, and she did a wonderful watercolor
Yeah.
of Timothy in the garden, as did actually Alice Paciullo. And I think it's this thing where we can all relate to this thing. And I think that's also one of the things about Gilbert White is that it's not just robins and sparrows, but these quite extraordinary,
Mm.
rather exotic animals and birds also, find their way into his narrative because he was interested in how everything connects. I think, his interest, for example, in migrating birds is, shows that he wasn't just thinking about the completely local, but actually how the local connects to the wider world. And I think that's also something when we take those lessons, it's so important to remember that what happens on our doorstep is just as important as what's happening in the Sahara, because actually the birds are going from these
Yeah.
places.
Absolutely. And I think what you said about there being certain motifs is definitely true. So you've talked on this a little bit, but about the different styles that artists use. Obviously, the style of Grimm is very different to Claire Leighton and Eric Revilius, but there's been a lot of different wood engravings, photography, lots of different styles. If you've got any
Well, I think
insights on that.
one of the things that fascinated me when I started to try and bring everything together to sort of tell a narrative was realizing that actually the first edition in 1789 actually has doesn't really have what we would today think of as natural history illustration.
No.
It has the views of Selborne by Samuel Euronymous Grimm. And I guess my favorite, I think, besides this opening vista, I think is probably the Hermitage,
Mm.
which is Gilbert White's Hermitage up on the hanger. And of course, the hermit in the 18th century, it was fashionable to have a hermit in the grounds of your country house. Um, Gilbert White's kind of uh, financial resources didn't quite extend to keeping a permanent hermit. So I think it was his brother,
Mm.
dressed
Yeah.
particular melon picnics and things like this.
Yeah.
And that's something I think, that Grimm depicts, and then of course Eric Revilius depicted, and then Ed Clues did his own version of a Gothic um, uh, kind of hermitage. But I think, besides those views, we have in that first edition there is a a kind of print of a um, a black-winged stilt, which I think is
Mm.
selective just because it has such a strange anatomical its knees sort of seem to bend forward. And I think that must have been the thing that interested White, and he wanted people to see that. And then you have things like an etching of fossil formations, Mytilus
Mm.
christogalli, And it was only really actually when the late 18th century, early 19th century artist Thomas Bewick's um, wood engravings of birds and animals were used for a later edition that I think that really close association started to emerge. And in fact, actually, they they were aware of each other. And
Mm.
Bewick's uh, History of British Birds lists birds in the order that they appear in Gilbert White. So he's kind of conscious of that. But of
Oh,
course,
yeah, yeah.
there's never any kind of record of the two of them ever having any
Mm.
communication. And in fact, actually, quite a few of the later editions were sort of copies of Bewick, and I think Bewick's daughters were actually um, not that happy about them. But Bewick, of course, led the revival of wood engraving in Britain, and it was who really, at the beginning of the 20th century, when wood engraving, I mean, the Society of Wood Engravers was created in 1920, and almost the first of the really kind of successful editions was in 1929. Eric Fitch Daglish, who um, did wonderful images on Japanese paper of things like the harvest mice gathering around
Mm.
this the nest, um, and um, and then Gertrude Hermes. A couple of years later, Gertrude
Yeah.
Hermes goes to Selborne, and she was working on an edition for the Gwynnog Press in Wales, but it was never published. And actually, she made these really quite extraordinary and slightly surreal images,
They're
which
amazing. Yeah.
only then, seen for the first time in the 1980s. And then, of course, Eric Ravilius the following year, and and various others. And so actually, I think this revival of wood engraving in the 1920s and 30s is absolutely closely associated with nature in
Mm.
um, in Gilbert White. But I think one of the other things is actually also how photography sometimes uh, is, some of the very earliest examples of nature photography were for an edition uh, it by illustrated with photographs by Cherry and Richard Kearton, who were two brothers, and I guess they were sort of the precursor of David Attenborough's
Mm.
natural history films, and they would actually, I mean, there are hilarious photographs of them hidden, disguised as cattle or hidden in trees in order to sit and get kind of actual photographs. And actually, what's quite interesting is some of these, this is, I think it was either 1902, I think, was the first edition of their with their photographs, and it was so early.
Mm.
And actually the crops on the photograph, they're all particular shapes, and it actually feels kind of quite avant-garde in a way. But I guess the other things I was there were lesser known figures that I started to discover as I got more and more into the research, and one of them was Claire Oldham, and I had never heard of her before I embarked on the research. And she was actually a wood engraver who was the niece of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of Sherlock Holmes. And I was trying to and I discovered this through ancestry.com when I was trying to find out more about her. And I think her mother had been Arthur Conan Doyle's sister, but she actually lived at Petworth in in West Sussex. And during the Second World War, she was in the Land Army, and at the same time, she did this series of the Women's Land Army, and she did a series of wood engravings, which I think are some of my favorite images. And nobody knows what happened to the actual original print. So I've only ever seen them in reproduction in this 1947 edition, which was published by the Cresset Press. But it's I think it's particularly interesting actually that there are a lot of women artists, I
Mm.
think, who have been particularly drawn to White. And I think, some of the most successful of the illustrations are by women artists. And I think that's something very interesting that actually he creates space for them as well. And obviously in the 1920s and 30s, wood engraving was a medium that was very
Oh,
suited, I think, to women because they didn't need big studios. They could work from home. So absolutely, I think there's all kinds of different things that come through the different media.
wow. So what do you think Gilbert White's legacy to the art world is? I mean, it's a big question to finish the chat off.
So I think, I mean, I think Gilbert White's legacy to art is this extraordinary, obviously the initial book, but then this layering of responses over a few hundred years, really. And I think what he shows is that his message continues to be relevant to us. And I think it's at its heart is the idea that in order to look after nature, to preserve the natural environment, we have to first notice it. We have to, and I think one of the things about art is, of course, that it takes time. You have to stop, you have to think, you have to process, you have to put it into your own visual language if you're an artist. And and I think that's the thing is that this extraordinary cast of um, uh, characters from nature, but also subjects. He shows, and I think it was Mark Hurld actually. I'm just going to see whether I can find something that Mark said. And Mark was the artist who he's a very well known contemporary artist who does a lot of collages and prints from nature. And actually, I asked Mark to do the very striking cover of the book in 2021. And he created a collage with featuring um, White's thrush, the Zithera aurea, which is a member of the thrush family, which was named after Gilbert White. And it seemed to
Yeah.
be this perfect thing to be on the cover. And he also did the title with hand-dipped ink to get that quality of Gilbert White's letters. But what he said about the book, he said, is the text is so visual and White is so particular. Each letter is a perfect distillation of a single moment. You can imagine White writing it every time. And I think in those few lines, Mark absolutely gets to the heart of why we all love White so much and why he still has something to say to us all.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And the cover is gorgeous. I've actually got the postcard of it that was the promo for the book literally here decorated my desk.
Oh,
It
wonderful.
it is, so I look at it every day.
And I think one of the besides, obviously I wrote various texts for it, but I think it also includes an introduction that was written by Sir David Attenborough. And one of the things which made me love him even more was when it was a text that I think he'd written in
Mm.
around 1970, so many years before. And I asked him whether we could reprint this text, and he reviewed it and he said, I've got one change I would like. And he said, in the book, in the original text, I said Gilbert White was the first man to whatever. I'd like to change it to Gilbert White was the first person. And I think it really just shows
Yeah,
how,
yeah,
David Attenborough is a man who has kind of traveled with his times in a way.
yeah.
And it also we also republished some of Gilbert White's poetry within it.
Hmm.
And actually the other thing that we included were poems by Jo Bell, her poem A Nightingale for Gilbert White, and also Catherine Beavis's vision for the Reverend Gilbert White. So
Mm.
you have elements of literature as well. And obviously, we've talked a lot today about the visual side of things, but we also republished a little known essay by Virginia Woolf.
Mm.
And so Virginia Woolf wrote the essay White Selborne, it was called, and it was published in the New Statesman
Mm.
in September 1939, just as Britain went into the Second World War. And there are just these wonderful passages in it, where she really kind of focuses on White's use of language. And I guess the other thing that we also managed to get permission from his estate to reproduce was W.H. Auden's posthumous letter to Gilbert White.
Mm.
And I think one of the things that really interested me was how so many poets and writers also loved
Yeah,
Gilbert White. And so although the book was called Gilbert White and the Artists, actually it's Gilbert White and the Artists and the Writers, because actually all of these things um, are different forms of creativity and really inspired by his
yeah,
work.
absolutely. And I mean, the Virginia Woolf essay in particular is an amazing thing, and it it really blows my mind to see how much of an influence Gilbert White has been, like you say, to not just some great artists, but some poets and writers and modern naturalists like David Attenborough, and the amount of people that we can say have been influenced or inspired by Gilbert White is huge, and in all different areas of life. In Bell's library, we have some fantastic quotes around the top of the wall, which have got a few of those. So we've got Auden up there and Virginia Woolf, David Attenborough, just to name a few, Darwin. And I do like pointing them out to visitors because it really gives a sense of just how influential this naturalist, which not everybody has heard of. And he did something, and we're still talking about it 250 years later. So, we always ask our guests a way in which our listeners and viewers could be more Gilbert. Do you have a suggestion?
Well, I think the question of being more Gilbert, I think, is something that we all have to approach in our own way. Some of us are writers, some of us are artists, some of us might just have an iPhone
Mm.
and we can take photographs. But I think the thing that, being more Gilbert is about pausing to look.
Mm.
He encourages us to look and to notice and to make connections between things. And I think in our busy lives, it can be so difficult sometimes to make the space to do that. And actually, these days, there is so much talk about mindfulness.
Mm.
And, in a way, arguably, Gilbert White is the sort of patron saint of being present, being
Yeah.
in the moment, being there to see what's beyond the window and actually to take ourselves out of the busyness of our lives. But I think it's also about what do we do then with that? And actually how how can we make positive change in a world where we have global warming and climate crisis? And actually it's a reminder that each of us in our own homes, on our own doorsteps, can do something. We can recycle. We can cut down on, our carbon use, or all those sorts of things. Or we can write to our MPs, or whatever it is. He reminds us that we can all do something to help make
Mm.
things better. And I think that is how I think we can all be more Gilbert.
That's wonderful and really inspiring. And I think you're exactly right. We're all able to do something. And Gilbert White was an amateur. Oh, thank you, Simon, so much. That was so fascinating. I urge people to go and find a copy of Simon's book, Drawn to Nature, Gilbert White and the Artists, which you can buy from our gift shop, but also many other good shops. I'm guessing your own as well at Pallant House.
Yes, it's also in the Pallant House Gallery. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to join you today. And as you just mentioned, our current exhibition is British Landscape's
Mm.
Sense of Place, which has got 60 artists and the British landscape, including, in fact, a few of the artists who also illustrated Gilbert White, such as Eric Ravilius, there's Piper, there's John Nash, and possibly and Claire Leighton, actually. So
Oh, wow.
there are several, obviously not the same
Yeah.
works, but there are several works to do with the landscape. And I think similar themes obviously emerge
Mm.
in the next about the landscape, and that's on until the 1st of November 2026.
Amazing. Well, we will be there. Thank you again so much, Simon. And yeah, see you soon.
Having some acquaintance with a tame brown owl, I find that it casts up the fur of mice and the feathers of birds in pellets, after the manner of hawks, when, full like a dog, it hides what it cannot eat.
So it is time for our object of the episode, and this one really wasn't very difficult to pick at all. It is this amazing print, which for the listeners is 2 hoopoes. They are pink and white and black with the aforementioned fantastic head plumage, and they are in a quite beautifully manicured garden. So behind them is a sundial, and we can see some roses and some well manicured topiary behind them. This picture is by John Nash, who we spoke about with Simon earlier. It is really special for many reasons. One, obviously, it was part of his illustrated Natural History of Selborne, which was published in the 1970s. But this is actually a proof, and we have another version of it, which is in a different colourway. So you can see that they were playing with colours, and I actually think this is what they landed on, this colourway. But this is Nash's representation of the letter that we are talking about today. And these are the pair of hoopoes, Gilbert White's most unusual bird, in his outlet or his garden.
I was much entertained last summer with a tame bat, which would take flies out of a person's hand. If you gave it anything to eat, it brought its wings round before the mouth, hovering and hiding its head in the manner of birds of prey when they feed.
The biggest thank you to Simon for sharing his wonderful knowledge with us. Please join me on the 16th of July as I will be sharing all of my research on our exhibition A Summer with Grimm, which will be good fun, and it would be nice to chat to people about it. On that evening, we have loads of things coming up. It's Gilbert's birthday in a couple of weeks on the 18th of July, and we're offering half-price admission. So if you're umming and ahhing about coming, come on his birthday. You know, give Gilbert White a birthday present. It's not every day you turn 306. And if you want something completely different, we have our big outdoor concert coming up this year. We are delving into the music of the 80s, not the 1780s, the 1980s. But if you fancy some great music out in our beautiful meadow, a great night is to be had. Tickets are on our website for all of those very, very different events. Thanks so much, and see you next time when we meet one of the most important characters of the Natural History of Selborne, the Harvest Mouse.